So kia ora everybody, my name is Misha Peters. I'm the Director of Assurance here at the XRB. I'm really pleased that I'm joined today by the GHG Assurance team at the XRB. So that's Karen Tipper, Nimesh Beaker and Anna Herlander. And really they're going to do the hard work for me today and walk you through our new standard which deals with greenhouse gas assurance. Before we get going, just to let you all know that the session is being recorded and the recording will be available on our website following today's session. The slides will also be available on our website following today's session. So I always get that question, but just to assure you, you will be able to access the copy of the slides on our website. If you do have any questions during today's session, please do feel free to pop them in the chat. We do have a busy agenda, but we'll do our best to find some time to answer those questions. If we run out of time, we'll endeavour to answer you separately and offline. So what are we going to cover today? Well, really, we want to give you a deep dive into our new GHG assurance standard. So we will cover a little bit of background, including why we have followed quite an unusual approach in developing a temporary standard. And this is really focused on enabling all competent assurance practitioners into this regime. And we've done that by allowing use of one of two international standards and then building requirements over and above those two international standards specific to this regime. So today's session is going to explain those elements that we've built over and above one of those two international standards. So what we will cover is the ethics and independence principles, the quality management principles, and then some of the additional aspects that we've added following our consultation process around the additional requirements that sit above the two international standards. So that's on fraud, the use of work of others, and we will finally end with the assurance report. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Karen to give you a little bit more background.
Thank you, Misha. So as you will have seen, our new standard, NZSAE1, was issued last month. And this standard is effective for accounting periods ending on or after the 27th of October 2024. So when we issued the standard, you will have also seen we issued a basis for conclusions document. And this basis for conclusions summarises the thinking and the decisions behind what we included in the final standard. It includes details of what we heard during our consultation process and how we responded to what we heard. So as Misha said, the standard was issued following the issuance of the XRB climate statements in December 2022. These climate statements require all climate reporting entities to prepare, the climate standards require all climate reporting entities to prepare climate statements. And part of those climate statements are subject to mandatory assurance. And this mandatory assurance is done under this standard, NZSAE1. This standard allows the use of two assurance standards, 14,064 Part 3 and ISAE 3410. And this standard overlies requirements over both of these feeder standards. So as Misha mentioned, and as you will have seen, NZSAE1 is a temporary standard, and you've probably wondered why this is a temporary standard. So we are aware that a number of entities are either already preparing or are well advanced in preparing their climate statements, and a number have been reporting already or are preparing to report in accordance with their TCFD requirements, while others are still considering and talking about their planned and expected journeys. Nearly all audit committee chairs that we have talked to in our recent research had entities that were using or expecting to use external consultants to prepare their climate statements. And the main reason that they were using these external consultants was the lack of in-house expertise over this area. At the moment, this expertise is rare, and the expertise that is available for greenhouse gas engagements in the market is heavily sought. So what we've heard in summary is that there is a shortage of expertise and knowledge about greenhouse gas auditing in this market. And we've therefore developed this standard to allow time for the market to develop and for more to be known about the future scope of assurance, as well as any potential licensing regime, and whether any developing international standards will be locally relevant for the New Zealand regime. Over the course of this temporary standard, we will be continuing to evaluate the effectiveness of the standard and to ensure that the regime has appropriate standards or guidance in place. And of course, we will be engaging with stakeholders to ensure a range of views are considered over this time. So currently, our standard has been designed to respond to the regulatory requirements that are to assure the small, narrow, focused scope of greenhouse gas disclosures within the climate statement until more is known. So that covers the standard and the background, but who can do this assurance? So in terms of our standard requires competence. Our standard is open to all competent independent assurance practitioners, and those competence requirements are related give equal weighting to both assurance skills and techniques of that assurance practitioner, and also competence in measuring and reporting of greenhouse gas emissions. So all assurance practitioners need to know both to be able to assure under this regime. This means that climate reporting entities may engage either their financial statement auditor that there is known to them, or they may appoint another practitioner who specialises in greenhouse gas assurance to assure their greenhouse gas reporting. The engagement that is done under the standard is a separate engagement to the assurance of greenhouse gas disclosures. So as a result, performing the financial statement audit in itself does not cause a threat to the provision of greenhouse gas assurance services to the same client. But Anna will talk to you in more detail about that when we get to the section on independence and ethical requirements. Then we move on to what is assured. So we in New Zealand have gone first. We are the first country to require mandatory greenhouse gas reporting and the assurance of this reporting. And that is mandatory reporting over Scope 1, Scope 2, and the wider supply chain Scope 3 emissions. We're expecting that all climate reporting entities will publish at least one climate statement before the mandatory assurance is required, as this is required from the 27th of October 2024. This mandatory assurance is subject to limited assurance, and we anticipate that most disclosures will be assured to limited assurance. Potentially, there may be some assurance we may see for Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions to reasonable assurance. But as we are the first country that is doing this, we also acknowledge that the systems for gathering this data and for reporting this data, and also the controls that are in place over the gathering of this data, are not likely to be mature. We acknowledge that data could improve over time and that emissions factors could also be more specific. We expect that there will be a lot of uncertainties within the estimation and a lot of complex methodologies that are in place. We anticipate that there could even be restatements in the future as the data improves over time. And we will go through the various reporting tools that are included in the standard at the end of this presentation to show how we can highlight the assumptions and uncertainties within these and the judgments that are involved. And now I would like to hand over to Anna to talk about ethics and independence.
Thank you, Karen. So, ethics and independence. At the beginning, I would like to highlight that Ethics and independence requirements are included in the engagement standards that the assurance practitioners will need to follow in line with our standard. Additionally, various ethical and independence obligations are imposed by professional bodies and accreditation schemes that assurance practitioners belong to. Our standard does not cancel any of them. So the assurance practitioners will need to follow the ethical obligations and requirements of the standard. As some prompts could be different from the professional bodies requirements or accreditation requirements, is that our standard is quite strong and very clear about independence not only of mind but also independence in appearance. We strengthened this the definition comparing to what we had in at our consultation stage. The independence requirements will apply not only to those who actually perform the assurance work, but also to those who can influence the result of assurance engagement. So, for example, those who supervise engagement leader, or those who recommend compensation for the engagement leader. The standard is set on well-known conceptual framework regarding fundamental principles that are well known to all assurance practitioners, and the framework to identify threats, evaluate them, and eliminate or reduce them to acceptable level. So, because this is well-known knowledge, I'm not going to talk about the conceptual framework today. Instead, let's do a deep dive into self-review threat prohibition. Our fresh from the press report that we released today morning about trust and confidence includes a theme brought up by the audit committee chairs that they need to consider independence of the assurance practitioners, as well as the expertise that they have. So audit committee chairs are thinking whether they are able to use the same consulting firm that helped them develop their systems and processes. But of course, there is a question, does consulting preclude from providing assurance? So whenever you will be considering if you could provide greenhouse gas related services, and you would think about being also appointed as assurance provider, you will need to have a look at the requirements of our standard regarding self-review threat. Our standard raises a very high bar, and it states that you need to assess if the service might create a self-review threat. And the word might is a key word here because it refers to a possibility. So when we read the service might create a self-review threat, we would like to think, is there any chance that the service might create a self-review threat? In standard setting word, we avoid assigning any percentage to the word might or to the possibilities not to create confusion. But in my auditor's brain, I like to think about this might as 1% or even 0.1%. So is there a 1% chance that the service that I'm thinking about might impact greenhouse gas records, internal controls, disclosures? For example, preparing greenhouse gas information. Is there a chance that it might impact disclosures? Of course, there is a big chance. So I am prohibited to provide this service, and our standard is quite straightforward. You are not allowed to assure your own work. You are not allowed to assure the information that you prepared. However, other services will be quite tricky. What about if my assurance organization has a very good IT product regarding greenhouse gas measurement. I will need to ask myself question, is there a 1% chance that when I will provide assurance of a greenhouse gas disclosures, I will be evaluating my judgments or judgments of my assurance organization, or I will rely on the activities of my assurance organization? If I conclude that, yes, when I will be doing assurance work, I will need to assess that IT system because it does impact the records, it does impact disclosures, then unfortunately I will be prohibited from providing the services if I would like to do the assurance as well. The application material in our standard includes some more specific examples about IT services, and I will be just like a little bit of spoiler that we will be issuing more guidance about self-review threat prohibition, but maybe I will not talk anymore about this now. So now I will pass to Karen about transitional provision.
Thank you, Anna. So you will have seen the transitional provision that's included in our standard. So transitional provisions are common practice within ethical standards when standards introduce or change independence and ethical requirements. So we at the XRB do not want to preclude assurance practitioners from this regime due to services that have been provided prior to knowing that those services may have impacted on their ability to operate on this new greenhouse gas assurance regime. The transitional provision has been designed to allow competent greenhouse gas assurance practitioners to transition into providing assurance services. So the transitional provision states that if an assurance practitioner has been engaged to provide non-assurance services that relate to the greenhouse gas information of the assurance client, and the work on that non-assurance service had already commenced prior to August 2023 when we issued the standard, and those services are provided for reporting periods prior to or ending on the 31st of December of this year, 2023, then those services can continue to be provided in accordance with the original engagement terms until they are completed. If these non-assurance services are provided in line with the transitional provision, then this would not necessarily preclude an assurance practitioner from performing a greenhouse gas assurance engagement under our standard for the accounting periods ending on or after the 31st of December 2024. So this means that previous non-assurance services prior to our standard taking effect would not impact on the assurance practitioners who could provide greenhouse gas assurance under the mandatory assurance regime. However, if assurance practitioners do take advantage of this transitional provision, then they must assess any threats that are as a result of providing these services and look to eliminate or reduce them. They also have to document all considerations that they have made in regards to using this transitional provision. This has to be discussed with those charged with governance or the board, and those services have to be disclosed in the assurance report. If the assurance practitioner cannot eliminate or reduce the threat, then they should not take up the engagement to do the assurance in the future years. To assist with this transitional provision and also independence requirements, and as Anna referred to earlier, we have been busily preparing guidance that we hope to release in the next short while to help practitioners with these considerations. And the guidance provides practical examples of how assurance practitioners can apply the rules that are in and the principles that are in the standard. And now I'm going to hand over to Nimesh, who will talk further around quality management.
Thank you, Karen. So quality management is a very important concept under this assurance standard, and this standard utilizes a principles-based, scalable approach to quality management. So the slide here outlines the need for a system of quality management, a top-down approach to quality management, which is tailored to the size, scale, and nature of the organization, and that covers the specific elements which are outlined. We expect practitioners to already be thinking about these things in their current operations, and we expect a lot of these processes are already happening to some degree. It may be that these aspects need to be more formalized as assurance practitioners adopt this standard. We won't look to cover every single element in today's session, but we want to focus on the critical aspects that require a bit more upfront thinking. And the first of that is risk assessment. And on the next slide, we outline the risk assessment framework, which is underpinned within this assurance standard. And it's really important for practitioners to think about a forward-looking approach to areas within their organization that may jeopardize quality. It is about thinking of what could go wrong in your organization and your assurance processes that may result in a substandard GHG assurance engagement being provided. Not all elements will be relevant to every organization. For example, if you're a sole practitioner and don't have any employees, you don't have to worry about communication within the organization. If you don't use any external service providers, you don't need to worry about the external communication to those providers. But each assurance practitioner and each assurance organization needs to carefully reflect upon which elements of the organization add to and which detract from audit quality, and look to implement processes in place to mitigate those risks. Developing and designing a good system of quality management is one step, but it's only as good as it is as it's operating. And so the bottom of that slide, the monitoring and remediation processes, is also vastly important, ensuring that your system of quality management actually operates, and being able to adapt it and remediate it and change it as needed is fundamental for this assurance regime. As Karen mentioned earlier, we expect GHG measurement processes, quantification processes, data to evolve quite rapidly over time. The way that GHG reporting looks like in 12 months may be very different to what it is today, and we expect assurance practitioners to be able to match that growth and that change, and the system of quality management which can adapt and change over time is important. So giving some considerations to monitoring processes and how you would do, say, root cause analysis and remediation work is important. We also recognize that this will or may increase cost and burden on some assurance providers. We're in a cost of living crisis, and I think the last thing anyone wants to do is talk about assurance fees and how much this process will cost. But it's really important to recognize that quality management and a system of quality management is an important value-adding tool to your assurance provider and your assurance report. The assurance report is not just the 5 pages of A4 paper that you get at the end of the day. It's the overall process and the systems and processes behind that which add value and add trust and confidence to GHG information. So we expect reporting entities and assurance providers will want to communicate and talk about their systems of quality management, as there will be a good way to gauge and justify some of the fees and costs that this regime may include. So the top-down approach to quality management is important, but there are also bottom-up requirements for quality management within this assurance standard. And the next slide outlines quality reviewer requirements. So this is an independent, competent individual who has the time and authority to challenge an engagement leader on the judgments and the audit assurance approach for that individual engagement. And again, we recognise, as Karen mentioned earlier, that there may be a shortage of practitioners in the country that can do this work, but it's fundamental that quality is maintained on individual assurance engagements. There is a lot of eyes on GHG reporting at the moment, and there will be a lot of eyes on GHG assurance reports in the future. So being able to use a quality reviewer as a safeguard for quality rather than a compliance exercise is an important mindset that assurance practitioners should adopt. We recognise there are challenges. Sole practitioners need to start thinking now about making arrangements with other practitioners to try and operationalise these requirements. Other organisations need to think about who exactly in the organisation can do this quality reviewer role, and again, perhaps needing to think outside the box in terms of who can do this if there is not enough capability within the organisation itself. So to summarise on quality management, there are top-down and bottom-up considerations and requirements in this assurance standard, and it's worth investing in. The time and effort that you put into quality management today will pay dividends in the future. So we encourage practitioners to familiarise themselves with these requirements, focus it and apply it to GHG assurance, and implement those processes in advance of the mandatory assurance regime coming into play. It will require a lot of professional judgment. There is no standardised template. There are no checklists that can be used. What matters is how does quality resonate within your assurance firm? And assurance providers will be the best placed people to know what could go wrong in their assurance organisation. So embrace the professional judgment and tailor it to your requirements. So I will pass you back over to Karen, who will talk through other elements of the standard which also require judgment.
Thank you, Nimesh. And as Nimesh said, we are aware that there will be a lot of eyes on the greenhouse gas disclosures that are audited and that are assured under this new standard. And that we are aware there's also high public interest in these disclosures and the nature of these disclosures. Globally, greenwashing is something that is gaining more and more focus. And we know that these reports will be subject to a high level of review once they are published. So therefore, we have included various frameworks within the standard. And the first one that I wanted to talk to you about today is a framework for the consideration of fraud. So underpinning this framework is professional skepticism. And the first thing that is required by this framework is that material risks of fraud are identified. And we believe there could be a potential risk of either underreporting or over-reporting. So there could be a potential risk of over-reporting your greenhouse gas emissions in the first year, for example, to be able to show a downward trend in the future as companies move to a lower carbon or transition to a lower carbon future. Or potentially there could be a risk of underreporting if KPIs are linked to certain carbon targets. So it's something that as an assurance practitioner, it's really important to actually have that good understanding of your entity's business and environment and the drivers of management and preparers and users of the information. So under the framework, after you've identified the material risk, the next thing is the determination of the responses, adjusting and setting the audit testing plan to ensure that fraud is considered throughout the audit engagement. And then to make inquiries of management and the board, or those charged with governance. So within NZSAE 1, we do require each engagement for the assurance practitioner to obtain a written representation at the end of each engagement. It is not specific as to what is required in that written representation, but one is required. So it may be that something may need to be included as a result of the consideration of fraud that is done through the engagement that may potentially require a written representation. The auditor is also required to respond and to document any considerations of fraud and any considerations that they have made while they have been doing their audit procedures. A similar framework has been included in the standard for management bias, and this acknowledges that the bias could potentially be conscious or an unconscious bias. Again, we have included a framework for non-compliance with laws and regulations. If an assurance practitioner is made aware of any non-compliance or suspected non-compliance, then the entity does not comply with, they have to discuss that, evaluate the impact, and consider reporting to those who need to know around the non-compliance or suspected non-compliance. And again, this speaks to the understanding of the entity and the rules and laws that they are subject to. And now I will hand back over to Anna to talk about use of the work of others.
Thank you, Karen. I will talk now a little bit about the use of work of others, which is a separate section in our standard. Why we included this in our standard? It's because we are aware that there will be need of a broad mix of skills that will be needed for the greenhouse gas assurance engagements. It will be especially important for scope-free emissions that can be upstream and downstream the value chain and can be quite complex. So it is quite likely that the assurance practitioners will need to rely on the work of others, and there might be a variety of those others. It could be greenhouse gas experts engaged by climate reporting entity. It could be people with GHG expertise engaged by the assurance practitioner. It could be also the assurance practitioner outside assurance organization. To avoid adding complexity and cater for the specific scenario, we have not defined all types of different experts, and we just named them all like others. So we are talking about using the work of others. So, the standard includes overarching principles that should be considered by the assurance practitioner when they want to rely on the work of others. And these steps will need to be tailored depending on the circumstances and depending on the types of the experts. So let's have a quick look at the considerations for the expert with greenhouse gas expertise, if it would be engaged by the assurance practitioner. The assurance practitioner would need to evaluate competence and capability of this expert and their objectivity, to inquire if they have any financial interest, business or personal relationships, or if they provided any other work to the client. The assurance practitioner will need to gain understanding of the field of expertise to be able to determine what would be the nature and scope and objectives of the work that he would like them to perform for the assurance practitioner, and then to agree this scope and nature and objectives with them. And finally, the assurance practitioner will need to evaluate adequacy of the work, and if it will be concluded that the work is not adequate, they need to consider what to do next. Shall they agree with the expert to perform additional procedures, or shall they perform additional procedures by themselves? And moving to the overarching principles, in case assurance practitioner would like to rely on other assurance practitioner outside of the assurance organization, assurance practitioner probably need to consider what steps from the slide before are necessary, plus they would need to determine if the assurance practitioner is independent from the information and from the client, if evaluate the quality management system to make sure that the results of the work of the assurance of that other assurance practitioner will be of appropriate quality, and to communicate with the other assurance practitioner about the findings. If there are other experts' consideration about relying on the work of others, again, the assurance practitioner will need to consider what would be the appropriate steps from this slide and the slide before. But overarching, or maybe the most important comment that should be actually at the beginning, is that engagement leader has the sole responsibility for the assurance engagement. So even though it's completely fine that the engagement leader will engage or will use others with specific expertise, will rely on the work of others, it does not reduce engagement leader's responsibility for the engagement. And also, engagement leader needs to have sufficient understanding of greenhouse gas emissions themselves to be able to ask the expert appropriate questions, evaluate the answers if they make sense, evaluate their work and integrate together with all other assurance evidence, and to take responsibility for the conclusions. So this is very important aspect when thinking about relying on the work of others, to have in mind the sole responsibility of the engagement leader for the assurance engagement. So now, after we assess and that we can rely on the experts, we can move on to forming our assurance conclusion and assurance report. So I will hand to Nimash, who will talk about assurance reports.
So the assurance report is the most important output that comes out of an assurance engagement. It is the most visible and publicly accessible output that is created, and therefore there are requirements around the assurance report within the standard. As mentioned earlier, the standard has been built on top of two other international assurance standards around GHG assurance, and therefore compliance with those underlying assurance reporting requirements is still required through this standard. But this standard also imposes additional requirements on assurance reports to bring a level of consistency between those two underlying assurance standards. This slide here outlines some of the additional requirements that are included in this assurance standard, which will bring about that consistency. It is really important that assurance practitioners read NZSAE1 and understand how an assurance conclusion will be formed under that standard, as it will work in conjunction with underlying standards which you may already be familiar with. A couple of the significant changes is the positioning of the assurance conclusion. The conclusion is now required to be the first thing in the assurance report. There has been a number of feedback across a number of years that assurance reports are quite long and aren't being read by users. So moving the assurance conclusion to the first position in the assurance report will hopefully give it more visibility and the ability to be read by users. Another key comment that we've seen is the level of, in the form of how a mixed assurance report may be done. So this assurance standard is flexible enough to allow for mixed assurance. That is, some disclosures are audited to reasonable assurance, while other disclosures are assured to limited assurance. And it's important that the flexibility of that reporting requirements are included in this standard. So there is the ability to express two types and two levels of assurance within the same assurance report, but there are strict requirements around identifying each underlying disclosure that is subject to that assurance. The way that that is structured in practice will vary based on each individual engagement and how reporting entities construct their climate statements. depending upon where certain disclosures are included and where certain underlying information is included, it may drastically change the way that an assurance report is structured. But again, being very clear as to what types of disclosures are subject to what assurance is fundamental. So while this standard brings about a level of consistency in underlying assurance reports, there is inevitably a level of difference that will be present within each assurance report. And we will touch upon some of these differences in the next slide. And one of the key differences is the way that assurance report conclusions are structured around future emissions. So future GHG emissions is very similar to the accrual concept of accounting and financial information. A future emission is an emission that may actually occur in the future, but is directly relevant and caused by current year operations, current year production, or current year sales. These must be included in the current year emission disclosures, and they must be subject to assurance. And we typically would see limited assurance being expressed over these types of future emissions. The differences in each of the underlying assurance standards is ISAE does not require these to be split as an assurance conclusion, and one limited assurance conclusion would represent the totality of the emissions. However, under the ISO suite of standards, there is a separate requirement to conclude upon future emissions separately from current emissions, and there may be two conclusions being formed, both to limited assurance within an ISO compliant report. If you couple this with mixed assurance, there may very well be 3 different types of conclusions in an ISO assurance report, where an ISAE report may have 2 types of conclusions. It's important to recognize that the scope of the engagements on here are the exact same. The level of audit effort to provide limited assurance is the exact same under both standards. These are different pathways to get to the same finish line, and it's the form and the output of the report that will look different, but the underlying process is the same. Again, it's fundamental that assurance practitioners understand the underlying requirements that they are using and how they will then communicate that in their assurance report. And it's also equally important that reporting entities understand what standards their assurance practitioners are using, so they can understand what type of output they will receive at the end of the day and what it actually means in practice. Another key element of how assurance reports will be different is the type of reporting communication tools that different practitioners will use. So this standard has been built off a number of different types of reporting tools that a practitioner may want to use to communicate certain matters in their assurance report. This slide outlines what each type of those tools are, and there is a helpful explanatory video that the XRB has produced, which talks through the logic and the differences in each of these types of tools. I'm not going to repeat all of that today, but it is useful to talk about what sort of emerging disclosures we have seen in assurance reports previously. We are seeing these types of tools emerging in current assurance reports, and we would encourage assurance practitioners to embrace this type of communication. So, for example, there are a number of emphasis on matter paragraphs now being included in GHG assurance reports, particularly around management's assumptions to Scope 3 emissions. And again, we would expect assurance practitioners may want to include such emphasis on matters in their assurance reports where they are fundamental to the GHG disclosures. There may also be emphasis on matters around comparative information where management have restated that information. As Karen mentioned earlier, we are expecting there will be a large degree of restatements as GHG quantification evolves over time, and assurance practitioners may want to emphasize where comparative information has been restated through their assurance report. Other matters can also be used to highlight any other matter that is useful to the user's understanding. And again, we would expect other meta paragraphs where there is a number of comparative information that may not have been assured or was assured by a different predecessor or assurance practitioner. Depending upon the number of years of comparative information a reporting entity decides to include, there may be a need for specifically tailored other meta paragraphs to outline the different types of assurance across predecessing comparative information. Key matters is also a very interesting one. We haven't seen key matters being used in a GHG assurance report as of yet, but this assurance standard allows for key matters to be included. And as mentioned by Karen earlier again, key matters are a way to describe your audit approach and your audit considerations on a particular subject matter that is most important to your overall engagement. We would expect to see key matters around the assurance effort done over scope-free emissions, perhaps key matters around your approach to data and maturity, or key matters around any other significant uncertainties and assumptions. There has been concerns around including key matters in limited assurance engagements or including it in a mixed assurance engagement on elements that are subject to limited assurance. But we want to reiterate that there is no prescribed mandatory wording that must be used when developing a key matter. It is up to, again, practitioner judgment and tailoring wording to your particular engagement in order to better communicate to users the extent of your work. So we would encourage and expect key matters to be included where you can clearly define and describe your own level of work, not just to aid in transparency, but also to clearly set the boundaries and be clear and transparent as to what you have done and what you have not done. To help practitioners, we will be developing some guidance around illustrative assurance reports, which will look to combine the requirements of the underlying standards and the new standard, and this will come in the near future. It's really important that these illustrative reports are taken just as that. These are illustrations, but these are not direct templates. These illustrations need to be tailored and changed for your individual assurance engagement, and these should not be used as a purely copy and paste exercise. So that brings us to the end of the slides and the topics we wanted to cover. There's plenty of time for questions, so I will pass back on to Misha for us to run through some questions.
Great, thank you very much. We do have one question coming through, so I'll give you guys all a bit of time to drop any further questions you might have in the Q&A or in the chat. But maybe I can pass this question to you, Nimish, because it relates to the assurance report. The question that's been asked is, should any emphasis of matter or other matter be the second thing in the assurance report, or would it need to be the first thing to include in the conclusion section of the report?
That is a very good question, and there's no prescription as to where an emphasis of matter or another matter would be positioned in an assurance report. But it's important to recognize what the intention of that matter is. If the emphasis of matter is highlighting a fundamental disclosure that the user should read in order to understand the GHG information, that should be prominent in your assurance report. So it should be very close to the conclusion, and it would make logical sense to be the second thing in the assurance report. There's no strict requirement around it, but thinking about what you are communicating and the best way to structure it, there is flexibility in how you construct an assurance report. That is the key message, but having the conclusion up front is required, and then how you position other things to best aid transparency and understandability of your assurance report is critical.
Absolutely agree with that. The whole point of all of these communication tools is really to try and enhance the communicative value So that's why we've allowed this flexibility to enable the assurance practitioner to order things to really focus on making that report as valuable and as useful to the user as possible. Is there any other questions? I don't see any other questions having been dropped in the Q&A or in the chat. Give you a few more minutes. Of course, you might reflect on today and then come up with a question and go, oh, I wish I'd asked that. So, you know, you've got our email address there. Please do reach out if you do have other questions. It's really interesting for us to hear what you're thinking about and worried about. And we will, as has been alluded today, look forward to releasing some guidance in due course. So watch out for our alerts. Sign up and follow us if you're interested in seeing what that guidance is about, because we are hoping to issue that soon. Without any other questions coming through, I'd really just like to thank our presenters today. You guys have done a great job at walking through our new standard on assuring greenhouse gas information. Thank you all for signing up and joining us today. Oh, we do have one coming through now, just as I was about to end off, so we do have a little bit more time. The question is, do you expect a fraud risk to be identified on all engagements?
Very, very good question. I think we would expect the risk of fraud to be considered on all engagements. Given the high public scrutiny, we would be thinking that there would be something that would factor into most engagements. Did you have anything to add, Misha?
No, it's a very good question. So we'll ponder that and think about it a bit more and see if we can add a Q&A on that. But I think I probably agree with you that, you know, yeah. Hope that's answered the question. Don't see any other questions. So if I threaten to end again, oh, there we go. Hi there, on fraud risk should be considered. What do we need to document? What on the fraud risk topic? I think the question is around the documentation of the fraud risk. Again, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Karen, I don't think we've specified the documentation requirements. I think the documentation requirements may be embedded within the individual international standards themselves. If you are worried about that and you think we need to be more specific, you know, do reach out and let us know. But our overarching idea is that we are layering requirements over and above the international assurance standards that you are already following. I don't know if you would have any other views to add on that one, team. No.
Yep, I would agree with that. Just that enough should be documented to enable the audit to, or the assurance engagement to stand alone, and that enough should be documented to show what you've considered, how you've addressed it, how you've responded to it. So it's all within the audit file.
The next question was, you mentioned that performing assurance for GHG information didn't necessarily preclude performing assurance for CRD. Please clarify. So I think the question there is, if you do, I think it's related to if you're doing the assurance over GHG, what other work can you or can you not do? So there's a range of factors that are relevant in making that this distinction. I think the point that we were trying to make is, just because you are the auditor of the financial statements, that fact in and of itself doesn't preclude you from being the assurance practitioner over the GHG information. If the entity is voluntarily seeking assurance over the full climate statement, it's required under the law that they have their GHG bit assured. you know, it could be the same assurance practitioner who's doing that work. So we are just getting a lot of questions around what are the different scenarios that would drive a decision that you have an independence threat or that you don't. And I think what we're sort of trying to indicate is that there's a range of non-assurance services that may really threaten that. But on the face of it, providing an assurance engagement doesn't necessarily create that threat. But you have to think about all the other services that are going on around it that may. Hope that answers that question. Anyone else on the team got anything to add to that? No?
No, I think that summarises it.
I'm going to need some help on these next two questions. For some companies, removals might be material. How well is the audit community prepared to provide assurance over removals?
This might be, so as Judy's online, isn't she, in terms of the reporting requirements? So in the reporting requirements, my understanding is that we're requiring gross emissions, and we're not as part of this assuring the removals as part of this standard. We're assuring the gross emissions totals, but I don't know whether Judy has any further comments on that if she is online.
Right, I am here. So yes, I agree, Karen. We have asked for gross emissions, which is before removals or offsets or anything else is applied. So for the mandatory standard, for the mandatory assurance, it would be that would not include removals assurance. However, they may voluntarily look to do removals assurance where they do have removals, and yeah, that's going to be a whole other interesting field.
Thank you, Judy. We really appreciate you being on board to assist us answering those technical questions. I do think we are now probably running out of time, and I think we've actually made it through most of the questions. But if you do have any others, please do reach out and look out for our guidance and be in touch as we work together to set up a successful regime. You go and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.